I still remember that day as if it were yesterday, though my hair has long since turned silver and my hands carry the weight of years. Life has a funny way of teaching lessons, often when you least expect them, and that morning, I found myself standing in the kitchen, staring at the refrigerator as if it were a treasure chest hiding secrets. My daughter-in-law, a young woman full of confidence and energy, had made a bold declaration. "This fridge is mine," she said, with a certainty I found both amusing and a little startling. I laughed softly, shaking my head. I had lived in this house for decades, cooked every meal, and stocked that very fridge with love and care. To hear someone claim it so confidently was, well, it was a little shocking. But I didn't let my surprise show. Instead, I wiped my hands on my apron, adjusted my glasses, and went about my morning chores as if nothing had happened. I could hear her humming from the living room, her voice carrying a lightness I envied, the kind of cheerfulness that makes young people glow. I sat at the kitchen table, my fingers tracing the worn patterns in the wood, thinking about the years I had spent here. The refrigerator had witnessed every birthday, every family gathering, every meal prepared with care. It had held the leftovers of joyous dinners and the treats I secretly bought for myself when no one was looking. To someone else, it was just a fridge. To me, it was a silent companion, a keeper of memories. I knew I couldn't simply argue with her. That would only cause tension, and life was too short for constant quarrels. But I also knew I wanted to remind her gently that some things in this house carried more than just food. They carried love, history, and connection. I needed a plan, something clever, something that would leave her understanding without making her feel humiliated. As I brewed my tea, I let my mind wander, thinking of small surprises I had prepared for my grandchildren over the years. How a little note in a lunchbox could bring a wide-eyed smile. How a carefully hidden treat could turn an ordinary day into a memory. Why couldn't I do the same for her, I wondered. Perhaps this was my moment, not to prove ownership over a fridge, but to teach a lesson in humility, kindness, and understanding, without saying a single harsh word. By mid-morning, I had everything ready. I had chosen a few of her favorite foods, something she always looked for, but rarely allowed herself. I arranged them in a way that caught the eye, colorful and inviting, almost like a secret garden tucked into the shelves of the fridge. I left a little note, written in my careful, looping handwriting, that simply said, "For the one who fills this house. With energy, may this little surprise bring you joy." When she returned, her eyes widened at first in confusion, then in realization. She opened the fridge, and as she saw the effort, the thoughtfulness, her expression softened. I watched her from the doorway, pretending to be busy with dishes, but feeling a quiet warmth in my chest. It wasn't just about food. It was about connection, understanding, and the subtle ways we show love without demanding recognition. I could see her hands tremble slightly as she read the note. She looked around, almost as if expecting someone else to be behind it. And then her gaze met mine, and in that moment the walls between us seemed to shrink. She laughed softly, a little embarrassed, a little touched, and I felt the tension of the morning dissolve. My little plan had worked, not in proving ownership, but in creating a moment of shared humanity. As the day wore on, I reflected on how often we misunderstand each other, especially when generations collide in a single household. Youth is confident, sometimes brash. Age is patient, often quiet, yet both have lessons to teach. That morning, I realized that sometimes a small act, a thoughtful gesture, could speak louder than arguments, louder than claims. And perhaps, just perhaps, it could leave someone thinking differently, feeling differently, and, if we're lucky, a little emotional in a good way. And so, as I sipped my now cooling tea, I smiled. That fridge, claimed or unclaimed, had become a bridge, a gentle reminder that care and understanding could turn even the smallest object into a vessel of love. I didn't need her to admit it. I didn't need a verbal acknowledgement. The warmth in her eyes, the quiet way she lingered by the fridge was enough. That morning I had quietly won. Not a battle, but something far more enduring. A moment of shared connection that I would treasure for years to come. The following days were quiet, yet charged with a subtle tension I could feel in the air. It wasn't the kind of tension that leads to arguments or loud confrontations. It was softer, almost imperceptible, like the quiet before a storm, or the stillness that fills a room when everyone is holding their breath. My daughter-in-law moved around the house with a new awareness, a gentleness I hadn't noticed before. She still hummed while tidying, still laughed when the children tumbled into her arms, but there was a pause in her movements, a thoughtfulness that hadn't been there before. I watched her from the kitchen window as she arranged vegetables on the counter, her fingers brushing over the produce with care. She hadn't said anything about the fridge since that morning, and I wasn't expecting her to. Some lessons I had learned are not spoken, they are felt. I had given her a little surprise, and now it was her turn to reflect, to understand that claiming something isn't the same as truly appreciating it. That evening, as the sunlight turned golden and cast long shadows across the living room, I found myself sitting near the fridge again, sipping my tea and letting the day drift around me. It was a peaceful moment, but it reminded me of how much life changes, how roles shift, and how even small objects, a fridge, a chair, a table, can carry stories of love, care, and history. Later, my daughter-in-law came into the kitchen carrying a basket of laundry. She paused by the fridge and looked at me, something unspoken in her eyes. I didn't realize, she said softly, almost as if she were confessing a secret to herself. You've always thought about everything, haven't you? I smiled quietly, setting down my cup. I've thought about the people I love, I replied gently. Sometimes it just shows up in small ways. She nodded, her cheeks tinged with pink. I noticed the subtle shift in her demeanor, a humility that didn't feel forced but natural, earned through the little surprise I had left for her. It was strange how the simplest gestures can speak volumes. The fridge, in a way, had become a messenger, carrying a message not of ownership but of consideration. That night, I went to bed reflecting on the complexities of relationships within a family. Young people are often unaware of the silent labor, the unnoticed sacrifices, the quiet acts of care that form the backbone of a home. My daughter-in-law, despite her initial confidence, had begun to see that life wasn't just about claiming things. It was about cherishing them, about understanding the history and effort behind them. And in that understanding, a bond could grow stronger than any argument ever could. A few days later, I noticed a small change that warmed my heart. She began leaving little notes for me, tiny gestures of acknowledgement, a folded napkin with a smiley face, a cup of tea left on the table just the way I liked it. Nothing grand, nothing extravagant, just small, quiet affirmations of appreciation. It surprised me more than I expected, not because I needed the recognition, but because it showed she had taken the lesson to heart. The fridge, once a symbol of contention, had quietly become a bridge between us, a way to connect without words. I realized then that life is full of these small, teachable moments. Sometimes we expect the world to acknowledge our efforts immediately, loudly, visibly. But more often, the real victories are quiet, subtle, and deeply personal. The warmth in her gestures, the softening of her words, and the way she began to consider the feelings of those around her. These were far more meaningful than any declaration of ownership ever could have been. That night, as I prepared for bed, I paused by the kitchen once more, looking at the fridge with a smile. It had been a silent witness to so many moments, birthdays, celebrations, and now, a lesson quietly taught and absorbed. I felt a sense of contentment I hadn't experienced in a long time. Not because of victory, but because of understanding, connection, and the subtle power of kindness. And as I closed my eyes that night, I knew that life had a way of teaching us its most important lessons in the smallest moments. A fridge, a note, a carefully arranged treat. They may seem trivial to some, but they can carry the weight of love, patience, and the wisdom of years. That week had reminded me that even in a bustling household filled with energy and noise, there is room for reflection, for understanding, and for quiet moments that change hearts forever. By the time the weekend arrived, the atmosphere in the house had shifted completely. It was subtle at first. An extra smile, a quieter step, a thoughtful gesture here and there. But it was unmistakable. My daughter-in-law had begun to move through the home, not just as a resident, but as someone aware of the life, the history, and the love that surrounded her. The fridge, which had once been the center of a small dispute, had become a symbol, not of ownership, but of connection. I watched her one afternoon as she prepared a simple snack for the children. She hummed softly, arranging sandwiches and fruit neatly on a plate. And then, almost without thinking, she opened the fridge, paused, and looked at me. I wanted to thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For the other day, for everything. Her eyes glistened, and I realized then that the lesson had truly sunk in, not out of obligation. Not because she had to, but because she genuinely understood. We didn't exchange grand speeches or dramatic declarations. There was no need. Sometimes the most profound moments are quiet, subtle and completely unplanned. She placed the tray on the table, smiled shyly, and left the kitchen. And as she walked away, I felt a warmth in my chest I hadn't felt in years. The feeling that hearts can change, that understanding can grow, and that small acts of kindness can ripple far beyond the moment in which they occur. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting a golden glow over the house, I found myself cleaning the kitchen, humming an old tune I used to sing when my children were small. My daughter-in-law came in quietly, carrying a small bag of groceries. She placed it on the counter and looked at me, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "I arranged some things in the fridge," she said, almost teasing. "I hope you like it." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "I'm sure it will be perfect," I replied. And it was. Every item had been thoughtfully placed, neat and accessible, a reflection of someone who had learned not just the importance of care, but the joy that comes from it. It struck me then how much life can change in small steps, how patience, observation, and gentle guidance can lead to growth in ways that confrontation never could. As the days passed, the fridge became more than just a place to store food. It became a symbol of our evolving relationship. The little notes she began leaving for me continued, sometimes humorous, sometimes sweet, always thoughtful. Each note carried a message. "I see you. I understand. I appreciate you." And each note, in its quiet way, strengthened the bond between us. A reminder that even in a house with clashing personalities and different generations, love can find its way. One evening, as I sat alone with a cup of tea, reflecting on the past week, I realized that the incident with the fridge had taught me as much as it had taught her. It reminded me that life isn't about winning arguments or proving points. It's about connection, patience, and subtle gestures that speak louder than words. That morning, she had claimed a fridge. By nightfall, she had discovered the value of thoughtfulness, of empathy, and of respect. And in turn, I had rediscovered the quiet joy of teaching, not through words, but through action, through care, and through love. The next morning, the house was alive with activity. Children ran through the hallways, laughter echoing off the walls. My son carried a sleepy smile, oblivious to the small lessons unfolding around him. And in the kitchen, my daughter-in-law and I moved side by side, arranging breakfast together. We didn't speak much. Our gestures said everything. A glance here, a gentle touch there, a shared laugh. The fridge stood silently behind us, no longer a source of contention, but a silent witness to understanding, compromise, and growth. As I placed a cup of tea in front of her, she looked at me and said simply, "Thank you for everything." And in that moment, I knew that life had rewarded me not with drama or confrontation, but with something far more precious, a heart softened, a bond strengthened, and a memory of love quietly shared across generations. I realized then that some surprises are more powerful than we anticipate. They don't shout or demand attention. They don't require acknowledgement or applause. They work in silence, gently guiding hearts to understand one another. That fridge, once a small battleground, had become a bridge. And as I sipped my own tea, I smiled, knowing that kindness, thoughtfulness, and patience had turned a simple household dispute into a story we would carry in our hearts forever.